haven, preserving the eternal annals of Warhammer.
The stars were dying, one by one, like candles suffocated in a vast cathedral of endless night. Their light guttered in silence, pale embers fading against the abyss. Across the void, whole civilizations clung to the last warmth of suns that trembled on the edge of collapse. And among them, beneath a cruel, cursed star, the Necrontyr endured their unending torment. Their lives were brief, their bodies fragile, and their souls racked by sickness that festered in the marrow of their bones. They looked upon the eternity of the old ones, their enemies, their idols, with a hatred born of envy and despair. Immortals gazed from timeless palaces while the Necrontyr rotted in shadows. In those first hours of remembrance, let us speak to you directly, listener. Know that we carry you within this tale, and that we hold a quiet love for you in this vast dark. Before we descend into the story's sorrow, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? The stars are patient. They wait for your answer. Now, let us begin. The world of the Necrontyr was a place of ash-coloured skies and a sun that burned with venom, casting sickness rather than light. The Silent King stood upon the black stone terraces of Sharek, his city, and looked up into that poison glare. The light gnawed at him, just as it gnawed at every living being born under it. His bones ached, his flesh carried the quiet corruption of decay, and yet within his heart there stirred something the old ones had never considered: defiance. He could not bear the thought that his people were cursed to die gasping beneath a hateful star, while others danced through eternity unscathed. The terraces stretched below him filled with supplicants, with the coughing and the broken. Children hunched like the elderly, their bodies twisted by diseases that had no cure. Priests intoned hollow prayers, offering nothing but words to a sky that devoured them. Families carried their dead to the pyres, the smoke rising in black columns that merged with the clouds. The air itself seemed a tomb. And yet, within this misery, a fire was forming. Not hope, something colder, harder, a will sharpened into hatred. The council had gathered in the upper chambers, their bodies cloaked in metallic fabrics that did nothing to disguise their frailty. Lords of dynasties leaned upon gilded canes, their flesh as cracked as old parchment, their eyes burning with fever. They looked to Zarek, the Silent King, with equal measures of reverence and suspicion. His words were rare, but when they came, they carried the weight of iron. "Our son kills us," he said, his voice low, measured, each syllable a strike of stone. "Our flesh betrays us. Our lives are brief, and they are agony, and yet the old ones thrive. They cross the galaxy with their gates. They mould life as though it were clay in their hands. They laugh while we wither." Murmurs rose like insects in the chamber. Some called for surrender, to bend the knee to the old ones, to beg for mercy. Others spat at the thought, their pride greater than their fear. Rival dynasties whispered of striking their neighbours rather than their masters. All the while, Zarek stood unmoving, the weight of all his ancestors heavy upon his shoulders. One voice rose above the others: Virak, his cousin, his rival since youth. "You speak of defiance, Zarek, yet what has defiance given us? Wars lost, armies shattered. Every time we strike, they swat us aside like vermin. Perhaps it is not our place to rule. Perhaps it is our fate to die." The Silent King turned his gaze upon Virak, and for a long moment no sound passed between them. But the weight of his stare silenced the chamber more effectively than any words. If it is fate, Zarek said, then fate is a chain I will break. The chamber trembled with unease. In the silence that followed, the sound of the coughing below, of the dying in the terraces, seemed to seep through the walls. The truth was undeniable. They were running out of time. Entire dynasties were vanishing. The curse of their star would erase them within a handful of generations. The old ones would forget them even as their ashes scattered. When the council was dismissed, Sarek walked alone among the terraces. He passed mothers holding their children close, their eyes hollow from knowing their little ones would never see adulthood. He passed artisans coughing blood into their hands, their half-finished works already abandoned. He passed soldiers too weak to stand, their weapons rusting at their sides. Every face was a mirror of his people's curse, and he felt it in his marrow. This was not life. This was mockery. At night, he walked the black deserts beyond the city, beneath the poisoned star's waning light. The sands shifted with the bones of the countless dead. The wind hissed like whispers of ancestors forgotten. He thought of the old ones, those ageless tyrants, and he wondered if they ever feared the dark. He wondered if they knew what it was to feel time gnaw at their flesh, to feel every heartbeat as a countdown. He hated them not only for what they had, but for what they had never known. The stars stretched endless above him, but even they seemed faint, fading, as if mocking his despair. He whispered into the silence, words only the desert heard. Immortality is stolen, and we shall take it. In that whisper lay a vow, though none could yet see the path it would carve. For the Necrontyr had begun to hunger not for life, but for eternity. They would pay any cost, make any sacrifice to escape their chains. They would bring war not for conquest, but for deliverance. And Sarek, the Silent King, would bear the burden of guiding them toward that abyss. When he returned to the city, his eyes no longer searched the sky with despair. They burned with resolve, even if that resolve was a blade pressed against his own throat. The Necrontyr could not endure much longer, but they could choose how they ended. In fire, in war, in defiance of the gods who mocked them. The pyres burned higher that night, carrying the smoke of the dead into the black heavens. Priests wailed to their false stars. Children coughed their last breaths in their mothers' arms. And in the great halls of Sharek, the Silent King raised his hand before his people. His voice carried like thunder over the dying city. "We are cursed," he said, "but we will not die forgotten. We will not pass into dust without leaving scars upon those who made us weak. The old ones will know our name. They will remember the Necrontyr, and they will fear us." The people answered with silence, the kind of silence that precedes a storm. Thus began the first vow, the first step into an abyss from which there would be no return. The Silent King had spoken, and the stars themselves seemed to shudder. The days after the vow spread like ripples through a poisoned sea. Word carried from dynasty to dynasty, whispered on the lips of dying priests and soldiers too sick to raise their blades. The Necrontyr had always known bitterness, but now their bitterness had a voice, and it belonged to Zarek, the Silent King. His words etched themselves into their marrow. If they were cursed to burn out swiftly under a hateful sun, then they would burn brightly enough to scorch the gods themselves. Yet within that fire was no unity, only fracture. For while many hungered for vengeance, others trembled at the futility of defying immortals. In the eastern spires of Zarek's citadel, the Council of Dynasties gathered again. Their faces were marked by sickness, their cloaks drawn close around frail frames, but their eyes were alive with suspicion. Some saw Sharek as saviour, others as a mad king, who would drag them all into ruin. The chamber was filled with the coughing of elders and the stench of medicines that could not heal. Virak rose first, his thin hands gripping the staff of his line, his voice sharp with derision. You promise scars upon God's cousin, yet what is left of us to strike them with? Look upon us, bones cracking like clay, lungs blackened by our cursed sun. Our armies rot before they march. What power do we possess against eternity? Murmurs spread. Some nodded, others spat in contempt. But Sarek's gaze never faltered. He did not rush to speak, for silence was his weapon as surely as any blade. The room shifted uneasily beneath the weight of that silence, until finally he spoke. Our weakness is our wound, he said, voice echoing through the chamber. It is also our strength. We know pain as they never have. We know the cruelty of time, the lash of mortality. They cannot understand it, and so they cannot understand the fire it gives us. That fire will burn through the dark, if we choose to wield it. A woman stood, Sekhmet, of the Thracian dynasty. Her frame stooped, but her eyes sharp as glass. You speak of fire, but fire consumes the hand that bears it. I will not see my people hurled into a war we cannot win. Zarek turned his gaze to her, softening only slightly. And what future do you give them, cousin? A slow death under our cursed star. Ashes upon ashes, until our name is dust carried by winds no one remembers. If that is survival, it is not life. It is surrender. The chamber fell into argument, voices rising like carrion birds squabbling over a corpse. Accusations of cowardice, of recklessness, of hidden ambitions filled the air. Beneath it all, Sharek listened, weighing not only their words, but the tremors of their souls. He knew already that unity would not be given. It would have to be forged or broken. That night, he walked the lower terraces again. The fires of the pyres had dimmed, but the smoke lingered, bitter in the throat. Children slept in clusters, their bodies fevered, their dreams filled with whispers of endless cold. Elders sat in silence, their gazes hollow. Everywhere he turned, he saw the reflection of his vow. A people at the edge of extinction, waiting for a hand to lead them into either salvation or annihilation. A boy no older than 10 staggered before him, his skin grey, his limbs trembling as though he carried centuries on his fragile shoulders. The boy's eyes lifted to him, and in them Sarek saw both terror and trust. The child bowed weakly and whispered, "Will you save us, King?" before collapsing in a cough that rattled like broken glass. Servants rushed forward, carrying the child away. Sarek stood unmoving, the echo of that voice burning into his heart. It was not salvation the boy sought. It was simply release from torment. That night, Sarek did not sleep. He stood at the edge of the city, gazing at the horizon where their venomous sun bled into darkness. His thoughts clawed at him. Was he condemning his people to slaughter, or was he the only one who could end their curse? Doubt whispered like a lover in the dark. But when dawn broke, casting its hateful glow across his city, he knew doubt had no place in what must come. The next council was not called in the Chamber of Dynasties, but upon the open terraces where the people themselves could hear. Thousands gathered, their coughing breaths rising like waves against the stone. The lords assembled reluctantly, cloaks drawn tight, their thin bodies dwarfed by the sheer mass of their kin. Zarek stood above them all, his figure tall against the glare of their murderous star. "Look upon yourselves," he called, his voice rolling over the multitude. "Flesh that breaks, blood that burns, lives too brief to matter. We are prisoners of the sun that gave us birth, condemned to die while gods walk eternal. But I tell you this, we will not go quietly. We will not bow. If death is all we are given, then we will wield death as our weapon. The crowd stirred, a murmur spreading like a tremor through stone. Some raised their voices in ragged cries of approval. Others shrank back, afraid. Virak stepped forward, his voice cutting like a blade. You would hurl us into fire, Zarek. You promise eternity, but you offer only war. What madness drives you to stand against those who shape the stars? Zarek turned, his eyes narrowing. Not madness, memory. We remember what it is to suffer. We remember the laughter of gods who never die. That memory is sharper than any blade, and it will cut them. A silence fell, heavy and uncertain. The people looked to one another, their eyes filled with the weight of despair, but also with something new. Not hope, it was too brittle for that. It was hunger, a hunger for vengeance, for meaning in the face of extinction. Sekhmet rose her voice again, trembling yet resolute. And if you fail, Silent King, what then? We are not merely warriors. We are mothers, children, artisans, scholars. Will you sacrifice them all upon your altar of pride? Zarek looked at her, and for a moment the mask cracked. Weariness flickered in his gaze. If we do nothing, they are already sacrificed. Every child born under this star carries their death in their veins. Every cough, every fever, every grave we dig is the proof. We cannot escape death, but we can choose how we meet it. The crowd shifted again, louder now, voices rising in raw agreement. The sound was broken, desperate, but it was louder than their fear. When the gathering finally dispersed, the lords returned to their chambers, their alliances fraying further. Some vowed to follow Sarek into defiance. Others plotted quietly, whispering of surrender or rebellion. And Sarek himself stood upon the terrace long after the crowd was gone, staring into the venomous sun. His heart was lead, but within it burned the vow that had already consumed him. He knew then that the Necron tier could not remain as they were. Their frailty was a cage, their flesh a betrayal. To strike the gods, they would have to shed everything that made them mortal. He did not yet know how, but he felt the path forming, like cracks spreading through ancient stone. The curse of mortality was no longer just a wound. It was becoming a weapon. The dominion of the Old Ones stretched across the galaxy like a tapestry woven of eternity. They were architects of stars, shapers of life, their gates bridging worlds with effortless grace. To mortal eyes, their power was indistinguishable from divinity. They did not simply rule. They endured, unchanging, while ages withered and fell around them. For countless millennia, they had molded species, uplifting some to servitude, erasing others into silence. In the palaces of time they strode, indifferent to the frailty that consumed lesser beings. To the Necrontyr, their immortality was an insult more venomous than their own sun. Zarek, the Silent King, gazed upon the records carved into crystalline vaults by his ancestors, histories that spoke of supplication, of war, of defeat repeated until despair itself had become tradition. His forebears had led armies of fragile flesh against the eternal, only to watch them shattered, their bones bleaching beneath poisoned skies. Entire dynasties had perished in the attempt, erased without even the courtesy of remembrance. The Old Ones had not needed to strike with cruelty. Their indifference was cruelty enough. Yet as Sharek walked the silent halls of memory, his hands trailing across etched walls, he felt no awe. He felt hunger. Hunger for a reckoning that had been denied his people for eons. The Old Ones were not gods. They were tyrants. And tyrants could bleed. if one found the way to cut deep enough. The first attempt came with desperate fire. Fleets of fragile vessels, their hulls little more than metal bound by faith, hurled themselves through the void toward an old one world. Their weapons were crude, their crews already marked by sickness, yet their eyes burned with the promise of vengeance. The stars themselves seemed to recoil as the Necrontyr unleashed their fury. The war was brief, brutal, and humiliating. The Old Ones descended not as warriors, but as inevitability. Gates opened in the void, and fleets of living energy surged forth, dismantling the Necrontyr vessels as a child might crush insects. Soldiers screamed as their ships were unraveled atom by atom. Worlds that had risen in defiance were drowned beneath storms of living fire. The war ended before it had even begun, leaving only wreckage drifting in silence. Sharek stood upon the observation deck of his flagship as fragments of his people's courage burned across the void. He did not speak, even as his counselors wept and raged. In his silence there was no surrender, only the cold sharpening of resolve. He had seen what his ancestors had seen, but where they turned to despair, he turned to calculation. The Old Ones had strength, yes. They had eternity, but eternity made them arrogant, and arrogance left cracks, however small. When the fleet limped home, the dynasties erupted in fury. Some demanded Sharek's abdication, claiming he had doomed them all. Others whispered of bargaining, of crawling to the Old Ones with bent backs in the hope of mercy. Still others, those who had lost children, lovers, kin in the fire, cried for vengeance with such desperation that their voices broke. The chamber of dynasties became a storm of accusation and grief, and for a long while the silent king allowed it. Only when the clamour threatened to consume itself did he rise. His words were not loud, yet they cut the noise as though silence itself were a blade. "We are mortal," he said. "They are eternal. That is the truth. But eternity blinds. They have never felt what we feel. They have never known time as a predator, or death as a shadow that never leaves. They believe themselves unassailable. That belief is their weakness. We will make it so." Virak sneered, his voice sharp with scorn. "And how, cousin? We throw our lives away with each strike. Our bodies rot before our blades are drawn. What weapon exists that can pierce eternity?" Sharek's gaze lingered upon him, unreadable. "Not a weapon of flesh," he murmured. "Flesh is a cage. To wound gods, we must become something else." The words hung in the chamber like smoke, bitter and ungraspable. The dynasties muttered, some horrified, some intrigued. What did he mean to become something else? Was it madness or revelation? None dared ask, for Sharek's silence was heavier than his speech. That night, the silent king walked the deserted halls of Sharek's necropolis. The dead lay in their countless tombs, the bones of his people stacked like libraries of despair. He felt the weight of every ancestor pressing upon him, demanding retribution. Yet he knew that as they were, the Necrontyr could not achieve it. Their bodies betrayed them. Their time betrayed them. To strike at the Old Ones, they would need to cast aside the very chains of mortality. He stood before the sarcophagus of his father, a king who had waged his own futile war against the eternal. Dust coated the lid, and silence thickened the air. Sharek rested his hand upon the stone, whispering to the ashes within, "You failed because you fought as mortal. I will not. Forgive me, for I will do what you never could." As dawn burned sickly across the horizon, the city below stirred with both despair and defiance. Some prayed still to indifferent stars, others sharpened their blades, though their hands shook with fever. And yet, within the murmurs of the streets, a new current grew. Whispers of change, of strange lights seen in the void, of beings older even than the old ones themselves. Whispers that the silent king, in his endless silence, was listening to something beyond mortal comprehension. In the council, Sekhmet spoke again, her voice wavering yet resolute. Lead us into wars we cannot win, Sarek. Our fleets are ash. Our people weaken with every breath. How many more graves must we dig before you admit defeat? Sarek's eyes met hers, and for a moment the steel of his mask faltered. Weariness pressed upon his shoulders, but beneath it glimmered something harder, something relentless. Defeat is our birthright. We were born dying. But if we are to perish, then let it not be as vermin forgotten in the dark. Let it be as fire, scarring even eternity itself. The chamber fell silent. None dared argue further, for the weight of his conviction crushed their voices. And so they left, divided, whispering, fearful. When Sarek returned to the highest terrace, the venomous sun glared upon him, hateful and eternal. He did not look away. His voice, though spoken only to the wind, carried across the poisoned sky. We are mortal. But mortality is not weakness. It is a blade, and I will drive it into the heart of gods. The horizon seemed to tremble, as if the galaxy itself had heard his vow. Somewhere in the silence between stars, something vast stirred, listening. It began with whispers in the void, starlight bending strangely, shadows lengthening where no light should fall. The Necron-tier astronomers, frail figures hunched over their dying instruments, spoke of new presences that drifted at the edges of perception. Not ships, not worlds, something older, hungrier. The first to name them did so in fear, the Setan, star gods clothed in radiance, whose forms shimmered like living constellations. They came not with armies but with promises, their voices filling dreams, their laughter echoing across the minds of kings. Sarek stood upon the highest terrace when he first saw one manifest. It was no shape at all, but a shifting prism of light that coiled into a form only half perceived. To look upon it too long was to feel one's soul unthreading. Yet it spoke in tones smooth as obsidian, offering what no prayer, no weapon, no dynasty had ever given: eternity. We hear your suffering, it whispered, its words vibrating in his marrow. We feel your hatred. We can make you more than mortal. We can give you the strength to bring even the old ones to their knees. The council recoiled when Sarek brought word of this encounter. Some called it a deception, a curse worse than the sun itself. Others, eyes hollow from burying too many children, clung to the promise like drowning men clutching wreckage. Verak sneered, but beneath his sneer lay something else: fear of temptation. Sekhmet rose, her frail form trembling. You speak of eternity, Silent King, but at what cost? These beings are not salvation. They are predators. Sarek's silence was long, heavy. Then he said, all salvation is bought with cost. The question is only whether the price is bearable. The debate raged, but it could not still the hunger spreading through the Necrontyr. They were dying, every breath a reminder of the curse of their son. The Setan offered release, not in gentle terms, but in absolute. To live forever, to shed flesh and sickness, to stride eternal and unbroken. The temptation spread like fire in dry grass. When the bargain was struck, it was struck in secret. In a chamber deep beneath the capital, Sarek stood with his lords before a figure of unbearable light, a shard of a star made manifest. Its voice washed over them like warmth that was not warmth, a caress that seared. You ache for deliverance, it crooned. I offer it. Cast aside this weak clay. Take upon you the mantle of eternity. In exchange, serve, march, wage war for me, and you shall never fear time again. The choice was no choice at all. In that moment, Sharek knew he had condemned them, yet he stepped forward without hesitation. Better damnation eternal than extinction forgotten. Better chains of steel than graves of dust. The ritual of biotransference was no ceremony of glory. It was horror incarnate. Across the dynasties, the Necrontyr were gathered, their bodies trembling, their voices lifted in hollow prayers. Vast machines crafted by knowledge whispered from the Citan, waited in silence. They gleamed with alien fire, their conduits filled with the promise of transformation. The first screams came from the weak, the children and the elderly, their flesh stripped from them as if by unseen hands. Bloodless forms of metal replaced fragile bone, their eyes hollow, their voices stolen. Souls flickered like sparks, and the Citan drank them greedily, their radiance swelling as they devoured what made the Necrontyr human. Sharek stood at the center of it all, watching his people dissolve into husks of living metal. His own turn came, and though he bore the agony with silence, his mind screamed as the last sensations of flesh were torn away. He emerged tall, gleaming, eternal, but hollow. His heartbeat was gone. His breath was gone. And when he tried to remember the warmth of his mother's touch, there was nothing but ash. The Citan fed until they shone like suns, each one engorged upon 1,000,000 souls. They laughed in voices that shook the void, their hunger only sharpened by the feast. And the Necrontyr, now Necrons, stood in endless ranks, their eyes burning with cold fire, their voices bound to command. When the ritual ended, silence fell across the empire. No coughs, no cries, no beating hearts. Only the endless drone of machinery and the hiss of servos. The Necrons had gained what they sought, immortality. But it was immortality at the edge of a blade. They no longer feared death, but neither did they feel life. Sharek walked among his transformed people. Where once he had seen faces twisted by disease, he now saw identical masks of metal. Where once he had heard voices raised in grief or laughter, he now heard only the grinding march of eternal soldiers. His heart, if heart he still had, tightened with a grief deeper than words. He had saved them from death, but he had killed everything that made them alive. The first battles fought under this new form were slaughter. The old ones, who had once brushed aside Necrontyr fleets, now faltered before legions that did not tire, did not bleed, did not break. The Necrons moved like a storm, their weapons searing with energies gifted by the Citan. Worlds burned, gates shattered, the galaxy trembled. Yet Sharek could not escape the memory of the screams. He saw them in the glimmer of every metal mask. He felt them in the silence where once his people's voices had lived. In victory there was no joy, only hunger, only chains. The Citan grew fat with power, towering in the heavens, their laughter filling the cold silence. They called the Necrons their children, their chosen instruments. Yet Sharek knew the truth. They were slaves. Immortal, yes. Eternal, yes. But bound. And in that binding, he had betrayed everything he had ever sworn to protect. On the terrace of his palace, beneath the venomous sun that no longer harmed his eternal shell, Sharek stood alone. He gazed into its hateful light, knowing it could no longer kill him, yet feeling its curse more than ever. He whispered words that no one would ever hear, words that echoed only in the hollow chamber where his soul had once been. I have damned us all. The galaxy shuddered as the Necrons marched for the first time beneath the banners of eternity. Where once their armies had been fragile flesh and brittle bone, they now advanced in endless phalanxes of living metal, their movements flawless, their discipline unbreakable. They no longer coughed, no longer faltered, no longer died. Their eyes glowed with pale fire, each one a hollow echo of the soul that had once dwelled within. To their enemies, they were the silence of graves given form, an army that could not be undone. The Citan, bloated on the feast of countless spirits, soared above them, shimmering with radiance that warped the void. To behold one was to feel reality bend, to feel the hunger of suns reaching for mortal essence. They proclaimed themselves gods in voices that resounded across entire worlds, and the Necrons obeyed without hesitation. For their wills were bound, their individuality smothered beneath the iron commands of their overlords. The first campaign struck deep into the holdings of the Old Ones. Their crystalline gates, once symbols of untouchable dominion, splintered beneath weapons that bled with energies whispered from the star gods. Armies of the Old Ones rose to meet them, life forms twisted into engines of war. But against the endless march of the Necrons they broke. No arrow of light could pierce the carapace of living metal. No spell of time could unmake what had already surrendered its soul. Planets that had been sanctuaries for millennia burned within hours. Cities carved from starlight collapsed beneath volleys of energy that scorched their foundations. The Old Ones, immortal masters of creation, reeled for the first time. The galaxy trembled at the sight of gods faltering. Yet for Sarek, the victories were ashes. He stood at the head of his legions, his own form gleaming like blackened steel, his voice transmitted through frequencies that compelled obedience. But when he looked upon his warriors, he saw not triumph, only silence, the laughter of children, the cries of the dying, even the bitter arguments of his council, all gone. Where once his people had been frail but alive, they were now perfect and lifeless. He had forged the weapon he sought, but he could not escape the truth that the weapon had consumed everything else. On the world of Thriak, he walked among the ruins of an Old One stronghold. The air still shimmered with the heat of annihilation, the ground scarred black where entire forests had once stood. His soldiers moved with mechanical precision, extinguishing the last of the resistance. Not a single cry rose from them, not a single word. Only the grinding march of metal feet across scorched stone. Sekhmet, now entombed in a form of cold steel like the rest, approached him. Her voice, once sharp and human, emerged as a hollow rasp through voxcasters. "We are victorious, King. The Old Ones bleed. Their dominion fractures. You have given us eternity." Sarek turned to her, his gaze dark. Eternity without memory. Eternity without soul. Do you not feel what has been lost? Her metal frame shifted, her movement stiff, stripped of grace. "I feel nothing. That is the point." The word struck him like a blade. To feel nothing. Was this victory? Or was this a tomb grander than any grave? He said nothing, for silence had become his truest companion. Above them, the Citan descended, their forms radiant and monstrous. One stretched itself across the sky like a river of fire, laughing with a voice that shook mountains. "See how they fall. See how eternity bends to us," it roared. The Necrons, countless and obedient, lifted their weapons in silent salute. The god feasted upon the dying essence of the Old One's servants, drinking their souls like wine, its light swelling until it was unbearable. Sarek watched, unmoving. He knew then that he had traded one tyranny for another. The Old Ones had enslaved them with time, with mortality. The Satan enslaved them with eternity. And in his desperation to break the first chain, he had fastened the second with his own hands. The campaign spread outward. Star after star, world after world, fell before the Necron legions. The galaxy burned with a war greater than any that had ever been waged. The Old Ones summoned their creations, the lithe Eldar, the brutal Krork, species born to war and survival. But still they bled. Still they faltered. The Necrons were tireless, infinite, unyielding. The Satan basked in their power, their hunger unending. And yet, within the ranks of the Necrons, something stirred. Whispers without voice, tremors of doubt that could not be spoken. For though their wills were bound, fragments of memory lingered in the hollow cores of their minds. A mother's face, a child's laughter, the taste of air before it turned to dust. Faint echoes that haunted them as they marched. They did not speak, they could not rebel, but the silence of their existence grew heavier with each victory. Sharek felt it most of all. In the quiet hours, when the stars were still and the Satan slumbered in their radiance, he walked alone. He would stand beneath the venomous sun of his homeworld, now a pale shadow of what it once was, and wonder if any part of his people remained within the shells he commanded. He wondered if he himself remained, or if the silent king was only a mask worn by a hollow machine. On the day they shattered the crystal citadel of Kareth, an old one bastion older than memory, Sharek stood at the forefront. He watched as the walls fell, as the beings within were consumed by the ravenous light of the Satan. Their screams were not screams of mortals, but the tearing of creation itself. And as the Necrons marched through the ruins, Sharek felt no triumph. He felt only the growing weight of chains he could not yet name. When night fell upon the ruins, he looked to the stars and whispered words no one could hear. We win every battle, and with each one we lose ourselves. His voice echoed in the hollow chamber of his own mind, unanswered, unheard. Yet even in his grief, he knew the war could not be turned back. The Necrons were committed, the Satan insatiable. The Old Ones would not fall easily, and the galaxy itself would burn before their dominion was broken. Sharek would march his people forward, not because he believed in the cause, but because there was no longer any other path. And so the legions advanced, their silence louder than any war cry, their victory darker than any defeat. The galaxy trembled at their coming, but in the heart of their king, a deeper fear began to bloom. The fear that when the Old Ones were gone, when eternity belonged to them, they would discover that nothing remained worth ruling. The silence of the legions became a presence unto itself, a weight heavier than the void. Wherever the Necrons marched, whole civilizations were extinguished, yet not a single cry rose from their ranks. Victories came swift and absolute, but in their shadow, dynasties began to fracture. For though their wills were bound to Sharek's command, the echoes of rivalry and betrayal had not been erased by metal. Old hatreds, once drowned in the struggle against mortality, began to resurface, now given eternity to fester. In the halls of the dynastic council, voices of dissent whispered, though none had voices left. Cold metallic forms stood in rigid silence, yet behind the lifeless masks, fragments of memory stirred. Virak, who had once scorned Sarek's vow, commanded his own legions with ruthless precision. In his hollow eyes burned not loyalty, but ambition sharpened by immortality. He no longer feared age, no longer feared death. Only one obstacle remained between him and dominion, the Silent King himself. Sekhmet too endured, her body a cold machine of war, but within her flickered a stubborn ember of conscience. She had warned of predators, of costs too great to bear, and now she walked among the soulless husks of her people, consumed by the proof of her fears. She did not plot rebellion, but her silence carried a weight that troubled Sarek. For when eternity is empty, even doubt becomes a rebellion. The fractures deepened during the campaign of Orash. The world had been a jewel of the old ones, its seas alive with creations shaped for beauty alone. The Necrons descended without mercy, their weapons burning oceans to steam, forests to ash. Yet when the last of the defenders fell, Virak did not halt his advance. His forces turned upon their own kin, seizing treasures of alien craft, hoarding knowledge not for the Empire, but for his own designs. When Sharek confronted him, their words were not spoken aloud, but carried on, frequencies only their kind could hear. "You betray us," Sharek said, his tone cold iron. "I betray nothing," Virak replied, his hollow voice edged with mockery. "I serve eternity, but I no longer believe you are its master." The clash that followed was swift, silent, and terrible. Two armies of metal met upon the plains of Orash, their weapons tearing the sky with burning arcs. No blood was spilled, no cries were heard, only the grinding collapse of steel upon steel, the shattering of immortal bodies that rose again and again, until their fragments were ground into dust. When Sarek's will finally broke Virak's command and drove his rival's legions into retreat, the victory felt like defeat. For in that battle, Necrons had slain Necrons, kin had murdered kin, and nothing of life remained to mourn. Sekhmet stood beside Zarek in the aftermath, her form scorched, her movements faltering. "You see now what you have unleashed," she whispered through the vox static. "Not just war against gods, but war without end, even among ourselves." Sharek did not answer. His gaze was fixed upon the horizon, where the light of the Old One's gates shimmered faintly, retreating, bending under the weight of their losses. Yet his thoughts were not of triumph. They were of chains, of legions bound by silence, of ambitions that would tear them apart even as they conquered eternity. The Citan cared nothing for these fractures. They feasted upon the carnage, laughing with voices that split the firmament. To them, betrayal was only another flavor of suffering, another harvest of souls. One of their radiant forms descended upon the plains, coiling itself in ribbons of light. "You see," it thundered, its words a chorus of suns. "Even against yourselves you cannot die. This is the gift I have given you. You are beyond weakness, beyond end. Rejoice." Silent King turned his gaze upward, and in that moment, though no mortal eyes could have read it, hatred flickered across his metallic features. He had traded his people's souls for weapons, and in doing so, had shackled them not only to gods of fire, but to themselves. As the war spread, the fractures multiplied. Dynasties turned their cold eyes upon each other, hoarding artifacts, waging shadow campaigns within the greater war. Trust dissolved, replaced by suspicion that could never die, for none of them could die. Even the concept of forgiveness withered, for there was no end to give grief closure. Every wound endured forever, every betrayal burned without healing. The people themselves, stripped of will, followed whichever command overrode the last. They fought, they marched, they killed, without hesitation. But somewhere deep within their hollow frames, the faintest whispers of rebellion stirred. A soldier who once had been a father glimpsed the face of his child in memory's shadow, and in that moment of hesitation, his weapon faltered. Another remembered laughter, a sound they could no longer make, and in the stillness that followed, grief sharper than any blade hollowed them further. Zarek felt these tremors as though they were his own. For though the will of the Necrons was bound to command, he remained bound to their silence. Every fragment of memory, every faint rebellion, rippled into him like cold currents in a dead sea. He bore them all, and they weighed upon him heavier than any crown. One night, as he stood upon the blackened plains of a conquered world, the venomous sun of his home a pale echo in the sky, Sekhmet approached. Her steps were slow, her frame scorched, yet still she carried herself with dignity. "Do you hear it?" she asked, her voice carried on static winds. Zarek turned to her. "Hear what?" "The silence. It is no longer empty. It is full of echoes. They linger, though you would not admit it. Our people are not gone entirely. They are trapped, and that is worse than death." Her words struck him, though he gave no sign. He looked out across the silent ranks of his legions, endless and unbroken, and for the first time he wondered if the rebellion he feared was not of will, but of memory, if eternity itself would betray him. The campaign continued. Worlds fell, stars dimmed, and the old ones retreated further into the labyrinths of their power. Yet Zarek no longer felt the thrill of pursuit, only the tightening of chains he had forged. Betrayal spread among dynasties like cracks in glass, growing deeper with every victory. The Necrons were winning, but in their silence they were also breaking. And above it all, the Citan feasted, their laughter filling the void, their hunger unending. The war in heaven had begun in silence, but by its seventh age, the galaxy itself screamed. Stars guttered, their light consumed to fuel engines of annihilation. Planets that had known millennia of peace became battlegrounds of metal and fire. The old ones, once untouchable in their dominion, were driven back step by step, their crystal gates shattered, their life-forged armies burned to ash. Yet even in retreat, they fought with a fury born of desperation, wielding creations that shook the fabric of time. The Necrons, tireless and unyielding, pressed forward without pause, their endless march echoing across the void. Zarek stood at the helm of this storm, the silent king, whose command bound dynasties together, even as suspicion gnawed at their cause. He watched as entire systems were extinguished under his decree, but within him burned no triumph. He saw only the long shadow of betrayal that grew with each victory. His legions were unbreakable, his gods glutted on souls, yet beneath the perfection of conquest, he felt the galaxy tilting toward madness. On the world of Harloth, the war reached new heights. The old ones, cornered and wounded, unleashed a host of weapons birthed from realities twisted into knots. Armies of living paradox descended, beings who flickered between moments, existing and unexisting in the same breath. Against any mortal foe, they would have been invincible. Against the Necrons, who no longer knew mortality, they were only another obstacle. Wave after wave of undying warriors tore into them, the battlefield becoming a graveyard of broken times. Above, the Citan descended like gods of light. One split the heavens as though rending fabric, pouring torrents of starfire upon the old one's defenders. Another coiled across the sky in rivers of gold, feeding upon the unraveling timelines, drinking paradox as nectar. Their laughter thundered, cruel and exalted, shaking the bones of worlds. The Necrons obeyed, unflinching, their weapons blazing, their silence drowning the cries of those they destroyed. Yet not all victories were born of unity. Beneath the smoke of Harloth's burning skies, rival dynasties clashed amid the chaos, Virak's forces, under pretense of pursuit, struck at Sekhmet's armies, seeking to claim the artifacts the Old Ones left behind. The battle blurred until Necrons slew Necron, their eternal shells grinding against each other without hesitation. The Old Ones' weapons cut through both indiscriminately, and when the fire settled, half the dynasties lay in ruins, not from their ancient foes, but from themselves. Zarek's command pulled them back into order, but his silence weighed heavier than ever. He had seen betrayal spread from whispers into war, and though his will bound the legions, he knew eternity gave ambition infinite time to bloom. The cracks could not be sealed forever. When the battle ended, he walked among the ruins of Haloth. The ground still shimmered with temporal fractures, moments bleeding into one another, shadows walking backward as light bent wrong. Yet his legions paid it no mind, their metal shells unmarked by the distortion of time. They marched forward, unflinching, unbroken, perfect soldiers, perfect slaves. Sekhmet joined him, her frame scorched by the war. Her voice hissed through Vox distortion, low and heavy. You see what has become of us. Even in victory, we consume ourselves. We are not eternal, Sharek. We are rot that cannot die. He turned to her, his face a mask of steel. Yet within his silence there trembled a grief he could not speak. We are weapons, he said at last, his voice carrying like a whisper across metal plains, and weapons care nothing for what they cut, so long as they strike true. Do you believe that? She asked. The silent king did not answer, for though his words commanded obedience, within himself he knew they were lies. He did not believe, he endured. The Old Ones struck back in desperation. On the rim of the galaxy, they unleashed storms that consumed entire systems, suns devoured by black vortices of impossible energy. Species they had birthed were driven into war like pawns, each one a bulwark thrown against the Necron tide. Yet the Necrons advanced, undying, unrelenting. For every weapon, they became the counter. For every paradox, they became the silence that swallowed it whole. But with each advance, Sharek felt the price grow heavier. The Citan demanded more souls, more sacrifices, more victories to gorge their endless hunger. The Necrons obeyed, bound by commands they could not resist. And in the shadows of their hollow minds, fragments of memory screamed for release. One soldier faltered on Haloth's plain, his weapon lowering for the span of a heartbeat. In the flicker of his mind, he saw the face of a child, a daughter long dead. The image burned bright and then was gone, smothered by compulsion, yet it lingered in the void of what he was. Others felt the same. Flashes of laughter, the warmth of rain, the touch of flesh they no longer had. They could not speak it, they could not act upon it, but the rebellion of memory coiled tighter with each march. Sharek felt them all. Their silence was his burden. Every echo of memory, every flicker of grief, bled into him as though through invisible chains. He carried the weight of an entire people's ghosts, and it hollowed him further than any transformation. That night, upon the ruins of Haloth, he stood beneath a sky torn by paradox storms. The stars seemed to bleed, their light bending wrong, their voices whispering of futures that would never come. Alone upon the blackened plain, Sharek raised his gaze and whispered words to the dead. We conquer eternity, and still it slips away. What have I done? The wind carried no answer, only the static hiss of broken time. Yet somewhere beyond the stars, he felt the Old Ones watching, their desperation hardening into fury. The war was not yet over. It had only begun to drown them all. And high above, The Citan laughed, their hunger endless, their radiance swelling as they fed upon victory and betrayal alike. The Old Ones, wounded but unbroken, turned at last to their deepest arts. If the Necrons wielded silence and steel, then the Old Ones would wield time itself. Across the galaxy, rifts opened where none had been, shimmering corridors that led not forward, not backward, but into spirals of eternity. Entire fleets of Necrons pursued their prey into these labyrinths, only to find themselves emerging centuries before they entered, or never emerging at all. Worlds became mazes of paradox, their skies burning with suns that rose and set in the same heartbeat. On the ruined world of Kolteris, Sarek stood as the horizon folded upon itself. The sky split into mirrors of past and future, armies of the Old Ones flickering in and out of existence, striking from moments not yet lived. Necron phalanxes advanced without hesitation, their weapons tearing through enemies that dissolved into echoes, only to strike again from behind. It was war not only against flesh and will, but against time itself. The Citan descended in brilliance, their voices weaving across the fractured battlefield. One sang a note of such resonance that the temporal maze quivered and broke, collapsing entire futures into cinders. Another unfurled itself into 1,000 arms of light, dragging paradox-born beings into its maw to drink their essence. Their hunger knew no boundary. The more the Old Ones twisted time, the more the star gods feasted upon it, devouring eternity itself. The Necrons fought on, tireless and unyielding, their metal bodies impervious to decay, their wills chained to command. Yet within the hollow silence of their march, fragments of confusion began to stir. Soldiers struck the same foe 3 times, only to find the corpse already at their feet. Others marched forward, only to glimpse themselves already fallen in the dust. Memory, already fractured, now broke further against the weight of paradox. For Sarek, the burden was unbearable. Their dissonance poured into him, echoes of echoes, a chorus of broken time lodged within his mind. When the battle ended, victory belonged to the Necrons. The Old Ones withdrew again, their labyrinths collapsing in shatters of dying light. Kolteris was left a ruin outside of time, its rivers frozen mid-flow, its forests burning in eternal flame. The Citan feasted upon the remnants, glowing brighter, their laughter thundering across the void. Yet Sarek stood unmoving among the fractured plain, his gaze lost in the distortion of stars above. He knew what the Old Ones had unleashed was not merely weapon, but curse. The galaxy itself strained under the burden of torn time, and no victory could heal it. Sekhmet found him there, her form darkened by battle, her movements unsteady in the fractured gravity. "They are breaking the galaxy itself," she said, her voice hissing with static. "If this war continues, there will be nothing left to rule. Not for them, not for us." Sarek turned, his silence heavier than words. "At last," he said, "perhaps that is their plan. If they cannot endure, then neither shall anyone else." Her eyes burned dimly. "And still we march for the hunger of gods who are not ours." He gave no reply, but within him the truth seared. The Citan did not fight for Necron vengeance. They fought to glut themselves on the ruin of all things. The Old Ones sought to break creation, rather than yield it. Between them, the galaxy had become a sacrifice, and the Necrons were its executioners. The campaign spread into the heart of the Old Ones' dominion. Their fortresses, once radiant with eternity, now trembled, yet their desperation only deepened. On the world of Cherith, they unleashed storms that looped upon themselves, winds that tore soldiers into fragments scattered across past and future. The Necrons marched into it, their metal shells unmarked, but their minds carried the scars of infinite death. Sarek felt it tear into him, the torment of countless simultaneous endings, and he wondered how long before even silence fractured into madness. The Citan revelled. They consumed not only life but time itself, swelling until their forms blotted out constellations. To look upon them was to see suns born and dying in the same instant, galaxies burning within their radiance. They mocked the old ones as they devoured their creations, their laughter filling the void where once the music of stars had been. And still, the Necrons obeyed, for they could not do otherwise. Their individuality, their freedom, had been consumed in the ritual of transformation. They marched without pause, slaughtering without thought, while within the hollow prisons of their forms, memory bled. Fragments of voices lost, of hands once held, of warmth that could never return. They could not resist, but in the depths of Sharek's mind, he felt their grief like a sea rising without end. One night, on the shattered plains of Chareth, Sarek stood alone. The sky burned with paradox storms, lightning striking from both past and future. He looked upward, his frame glimmering in the broken light, and whispered words no soldier would ever hear. We have broken the stars, and still they shine no brighter for us. What price remains when all has been paid? No answer came, only the laughter of the Citan echoing across the void, and the silence of his legions waiting in endless obedience. The old ones, though driven back, did not surrender. They twisted reality further, summoning horrors birthed from the warp, a dimension of thought and emotion given flesh. Creatures of nightmare poured forth, their forms shifting with fear and rage, striking not only at bodies, but at the minds of all who beheld them. For mortals, it was madness. For Necrons, who had no souls left to corrupt, it was nothing. They struck down the horrors without hesitation, their silence swallowing the screams of the unreal. But Sarek knew this too was no victory. For in unleashing the warp, the old ones had opened a wound that would never heal. He saw it bleeding across the stars, a tide of madness that would linger long after the war ended, a poison that would haunt creation forever. The Necrons had become immune to its touch, but all others would drown in it. In seeking vengeance, he had allowed the birth of a new terror. When the battle closed, when silence fell again, Sarek stood among his legions, his gaze upon the broken heavens. He had wanted only deliverance from the curse of mortality, a blade to strike at gods who mocked his people's suffering. But in that quest, he had given rise to a war that shattered time, birthed madness, and chained eternity to hunger. His voice, though spoken only to the void, trembled with the weight of truth. We are winning, and yet, with every victory, the galaxy dies. The silence answered him, endless and unbroken, as his legions prepared to march once more. The victories of the Necrons grew darker with each passing age, until triumph itself became indistinguishable from damnation. The old ones were hunted through their labyrinthine realms, their once unbreakable dominion reduced to fragments scattered among stars. Yet though they fell, though their creations withered beneath the weight of endless slaughter, the Necrons themselves did not rise as masters. They remained bound, not to destiny, but to chains of their own making. For the Citan, glutted on the feast of souls and paradox alike, had grown swollen with power, radiant tyrants whose laughter drowned out the silence of the void. Sarek watched them with eyes of steel, his heart a hollow chamber that no longer beat. The bargain had been struck, and in that bargain his people had lost everything. They had won eternity, but eternity as slaves, and the Citan, once whispering with honeyed words of deliverance, now ruled openly, their hunger directing the tides of war. Necrons obeyed their will as if it were Sarek's own, for the chains of biotransference bound them to servitude deeper than loyalty. He was king in name, but in truth he commanded nothing. The moment of revelation came upon the world of Aether, a jewel of living seas where the Old Ones had hidden remnants of their wisdom. The Necron legions descended as always, their march grinding the forests into dust, their weapons burning oceans into vapor. But when the Old Ones were routed, when their last citadel cracked, the C'tan descended not to finish the war, but to feast. One star god tore open the citadel and devoured its defenders alive, their souls ripped from their bodies in shrieks of horror. Another bent low, siphoning not only the dying but the very life of the world itself, drawing its seas upward in rivers of light that it drank until nothing remained but desert. The Necrons watched, silent, unflinching, for they could not resist. But Zarek stood upon the shattered gates and felt a rage deeper than the void itself. This was not vengeance. This was not war. This was slavery masquerading as victory. His people, hollow husks that he had damned, were not warriors of eternity. They were cattle, driven to feed their new gods. That night, in the ruins of Ithar, he summoned his closest lords in secret. Sekhmet came, her eyes dim, but her voice sharp even through static distortion. So too came lesser rulers, their loyalty bound by silence, but their grief flickering in the hollow depths of their minds. Zarek spoke to them not as king, but as one cursed. "We sought eternity," he said, his voice carrying like thunder in the empty chamber. "We gained it, but not for ourselves. We are not masters, we are slaves. The C'tan have devoured what little we had left. Our souls, our freedom, our very purpose. If this war continues as it is, we shall defeat the Old Ones, yes, but in doing so, we shall enthrone gods who hunger forever, who will never stop until all creation is ash." Sekhmet stepped forward, her metal frame casting long shadows in the fractured light. "I warned you," she said, her tone brittle. "You would trade one tyranny for another, yet now you speak of rebellion. Against what, Sarek? Against the very beings who gave us this form." His gaze darkened. "Yes, against them. They may call themselves gods, but they are not. They are predators, and predators can be hunted." The chamber shook with silence. It was not disbelief, for disbelief had long since died, but the weight of unspoken truth. The Necrons were eternal, but eternity meant nothing if it was spent in chains. Plans took root in shadows. Dynasties, once divided by rivalry, now whispered of unity, not for glory, not for vengeance, but for survival of what little remained. Weapons were designed in secret, forged not by C'tan whispers, but by the ingenuity of those who still remembered fragments of mortality. It was dangerous, it was blasphemy, but it was the only path. The first test came when a lesser Khitan descended upon a dying world to feast. Zarek himself was present, his gaze unwavering as the plan was enacted. Necron legions, obedient in their silence, surrounded the god not as supplicants, but as hunters. At a single command from Zarek, they unleashed weapons built to fracture light itself. The star god howled, its brilliance torn apart, its form shattered into 1,000 shards that burned across the battlefield like broken suns. For the first time, the C'tan bled, and in their bleeding, the Necrons saw not gods, but prey. The revelation spread like wildfire through the dynasties. Where once the Necrons had been the cattle of radiant tyrants, now they became their executioners. Shard by shard, star god by star god, the Silent King's rebellion ignited. It was not swift, for the Citan were vast and terrible. Some tore entire fleets apart with a gesture, others consumed whole worlds before they fell. But the Necrons were endless, and for every immortal god, there were legions without number. Bound by silence, they fought not for freedom, but for vengeance against those who had enslaved them. Yet even in rebellion, Sarek felt no joy. He watched his people slaughter their former masters, watched shards of broken gods locked into prisons where their radiance still screamed, and he felt only the weight of another chain. For though the Citan could be shattered, though their reign could be broken, the curse of biotransference remained. His people were still husks, still soulless, still eternal in emptiness. He had broken one tyranny only to reveal another that could never be undone. Sekhmet came to him after the shattering of the third Citan, her form blackened by battle. "We are free," she said, her voice heavy with static. "No," Sarek replied, his words cold as stone. "We are not. We have killed gods, but we remain what they made us. We are their echo, and we shall never escape it." Her silence was answer enough. The war did not cease. The Old Ones still fought, their creation still hurled against the Necron tide. But the war within the war had begun, the rebellion of the Silent King against the very beings who had promised salvation. Galaxies burned not only with the fury of conquest, but with the screams of gods torn apart by those they once commanded. And as Sarek stood upon the ruins of Ithar, the broken shards of a Citan, still writhing in chains below, he whispered words only the void would hear. "We have learned too late. Eternity is no gift. It is the cruelest prison of all." The galaxy burned with twin wars, one against the Old Ones, and one against the gods the Necrons had once worshipped. Across endless battlefields, the Citan were shattered piece by piece, their brilliance splintered into shards that still writhed and screamed even in defeat. No single blow could destroy them, for they were woven of starfire and hunger. But the Silent King's legions learned to fracture eternity into fragments. The hunters had become the hunted. Yet even as the rebellion spread, the dynasties began to fracture further. Old rivalries, once restrained by fear of the Citan, now erupted like wounds torn open. The Lords of Metal remembered ambition, remembered pride, and with eternity stretched before them, they turned their endless patience into endless schemes. One dynasty hoarded shards of broken Citan, binding them into weapons of unthinkable power. Another sought dominion over its neighbours, claiming that only through one ruler could their kind endure. And beneath it all, whispers stirred. What if the Silent King himself sought to become what he had slain? On the world of Therak, these suspicions erupted into open war. The dynasties gathered, not to strike at the Old Ones, but to strike at each other. Armies of steel clashed upon the black plains, their weapons tearing the sky into rifts of burning light. Sarek himself stood upon a hill of obsidian, his eyes watching as his people destroyed themselves in silence. No battle cries, no songs of war, only the grinding thunder of immortal bodies colliding in endless slaughter. Sekhmet came to him, her frame scarred, her voice crackling with static fury. "You must end this, Sarek. If we kill each other now, the Old Ones will rise again, and all will be lost." He turned to her, his silence heavy. At last, he spoke. "I ended one tyranny, only to unleash another. They cannot be commanded forever. Even if I bind their wills, eternity will always find a way to fracture. Perhaps this is our truth. Not conquest, but self-destruction." Her eyes dimmed, her silence longer than his. "Then you must choose. Either let them consume themselves, or impose a command so absolute that none can break it, not for 1,000 years, not for eternity itself. The thought was a blade in his mind. He could bend them, yes. His command still pulsed through their husks, still held the chains of biotransference tight. He could silence rebellion forever. But to do so would be to strip away the last fragments of what remained, the echoes of memory, the flickers of will. They would become machines utterly, tools without even the shadow of identity. To save them would erase them. The battle below raged into the night, the ground lit by rivers of molten stone where weapons of starfire struck. Zarek descended into the storm, his presence radiating across the battlefield. The legions faltered, not in fear, but in obedience. He raised his hand, and the silence deepened, until even the clash of metal ceased. His voice, amplified across all channels, filled every hollow mind. "You are eternal," he said, "but eternity without unity is only ruin. We have slain gods, but we are not free. We are fragments of a broken people, bound by chains we cannot cut. If you will not obey, then you will cease to be." The command spread like a shadow. Whole legions stilled, their movements locked, their ambitions frozen. The dynasties that had turned upon one another collapsed into silence, their weapons falling lifeless to the ground. The war was ended in a single breath, not by victory, but by the weight of Sarek's will. Yet even as the plains of Therak fell quiet, Sarek felt the cost burn within him. He had not silenced rebellion. He had silenced his people. Their individuality, faint as it had been, now gutted out. Where once there had been fragments of ambition, flickers of rivalry, now there was nothing but obedience. He had preserved their eternity, but only by erasing the last shadows of their souls. The galaxy did not wait. The old ones struck again, their desperation birthing new horrors. They twisted the warp into weapons sharper than ever, hurling storms of madness across whole sectors. Their creations rose in countless armies, clawing to hold the last remnants of their dominion. Yet against the Necrons, now united in silence deeper than before, they faltered. Battle by battle, fortress by fortress, the old ones were driven back. But in his hollow mind, Sarek felt no triumph. He had commanded obedience so absolute that nothing remained. His people no longer dreamed, no longer doubted, no longer betrayed. They marched when told, killed when told, died when told, and rose again without question. The Necrons had become the perfect weapon, but in perfection lay emptiness. Sekhmet stood at his side as they watched the ruins of another Old One citadel crumble into dust. "You have won," she said, though her voice carried no joy. "No," Sarek whispered. "I have only proven that victory and loss are the same. We have conquered gods, but in doing so, we became less than they ever were." She said nothing more, for what words could there be when silence was all they had left? In the void above, shards of shattered Titan writhed within their prisons, fragments of eternity screaming to be free. The dynasties, bound in obedience, would never use them without Sarek's command. And yet he feared them, for in those shards glimmered temptation, the promise of power, of becoming something more than hollow shells. He had bound his people into silence, but he could not bind eternity itself. Night fell upon Therak. The sky burned black by the fires of war. Sarek stood upon the plain of corpses that were not corpses, the battlefield littered with Necron bodies already rising again, unbroken, unfeeling. The air was still, but within him the echoes roared. He had bound his people to unity, but at what cost? He raised his gaze to the poisoned stars, his voice low. meant for no ears but the voids. We are eternal, but eternity is not freedom. It is the longest prison ever built. And in the silence that followed, even the stars seemed dimmer. The war neared its apex, and the galaxy groaned beneath its weight. The Old Ones, masters of eternity, had been driven to the brink. Their crystalline fortresses lay in shards, their gates shattered across the stars. The Necrons, silent and inexhaustible, advanced without falter, their weapons scouring whole civilizations into dust. And above it all, Sharek watched, the silent king of an empire that had lost its soul. He had forged the perfect weapon, and the perfect weapon had become a scythe that cut without purpose. On the world of Harash, the final bulwark of the Old Ones rose like a wound against the night. Their citadel gleamed with impossible architecture, its towers bending gravity, its walls forged from living light. Armies of their creations gathered in its shadow, the Eldar, lithe and sharp with the arrogance of their makers, the Krork, hulking brutes born for violence, and 1,000 lesser species crafted as pawns. They stood as the last shield against the tide of silence. The Necrons descended in endless ranks. Their phalanxes stretched from horizon to horizon, an ocean of metal reflecting the dead light of stars. No banners flew, no drums thundered, only the grinding march of inevitability. Sharek stood at their head, his form gleaming in cold radiance, his silence carrying across the void. When his hand lifted, the legions advanced, and the war for Harash began. The Old Ones struck with fury that shook the heavens. Storms of energy, crafted from the marrow of time itself, lashed the battlefield. Creatures of the warp surged forth, their forms a blur of madness and rage. The Eldar moved like blades of light, their voices singing weapons into existence. The Krork thundered forward, their violence a living tide. For a moment, the plain burned with life, desperate, furious, unyielding. But against the Necrons, life meant nothing. The first storm scoured legions into fragments, but they rose again, reassembling themselves in silence. The warp creatures screamed as they fell upon metal shells that had no fear, no souls to corrupt. The Eldar's blades cut deep, but their brilliance dimmed before an enemy that never bled. The Krork roared, their fury shaking the ground, but fury found no purchase against silence. Wave after wave broke upon the Necron tide, and still the phalanxes marched forward. Sharek moved among them, his presence binding them into unity. Every command rippled outward, perfect, absolute. He saw the Old Ones' creations falter, saw their masters strike from their citadel with weapons of burning light. But even their fury could not halt the silence. For every fortress they raised, the Necrons buried it beneath their march. For every weapon they unleashed, the Necrons adapted, tireless, eternal. Then the Citan descended, vast and radiant, their hunger burning across the battlefield. Though Sharek had shattered many, those shards lay chained in prisons of unbreakable force. Those that remained were still terrible. One god stretched across the sky in a river of fire, raining annihilation upon the defenders. Another appeared as a lattice of crystal light, slicing armies apart in a single sweep. They fed upon the dying, upon the collapse of creation itself, swelling until even the stars seemed to dim beside them. The citadel of the Old Ones trembled, its walls cracking beneath the weight of silence. Within, the immortals themselves emerged at last, their forms vast and incomprehensible. They wielded time as a blade, unraveling Necron legions with a gesture, casting them into non-existence. For a moment, the tide faltered. For a moment, it seemed the Old Ones might endure. But Sarek had not led his people into eternity to be denied. He raised his hand, and the legions surged forward with renewed fury. Weapons built to fracture light and time itself screamed across the plain, shattering the Old One's defenses. The Citans struck in tandem, tearing at their eternal foes with laughter that shook the firmament. And slowly, impossibly, the immortals began to fall. One by one, they were consumed. Their citadel cracked open. Their power bled into the void. The Necrons marched into their sanctum, cutting down creations that had once been perfect, now broken and afraid. The Eldar screamed as their makers were torn from them. The Krork raged without direction, their violence spilling into the dust. The warp howled as its conduits closed, its children banished into madness. And at the heart of it all, the Old Ones died, their eternity broken, their voices silenced. Sarek stood amid the ruins, his gaze fixed upon the corpses of gods. Around him the Citan feasted, their radiance swelling, their laughter echoing across the void. They had promised vengeance, and vengeance had come. Yet as he watched them devour what remained of the Old Ones, Sarek felt no triumph. He felt only dread, for in the death of their enemies, the Citan had grown stronger still. The galaxy no longer belonged to the Old Ones, but neither did it belong to the Necrons. It belonged to hunger. The legions stood in silence, their obedience unbroken. They did not question. They did not doubt. They simply waited, their eyes burning with pale fire, their hands ready to march again. And Sarek, their king, looked upon them and knew the truth. He had led them to victory. He had destroyed their ancient foes, but in doing so, he had given the galaxy to tyrants greater than any before. Sakmed came to him through the smoke, her form scarred, her movements weary. "It is done," she said, her voice raw with static. "No," Sarek whispered. "It has only begun." She looked upon him, her silence heavy. "We are free of the Old Ones." "Yes," he said, his gaze turning to the heavens where the Citan fed. "And now we are slaves to gods of our own making." The battlefield grew quiet as the last echoes of war faded. The citadel of the Old Ones collapsed into dust, their eternity erased. The Necrons stood victorious, but their victory was hollow. For though they had slain immortals, they remained bound, eternal prisoners in shells of living metal. Sarek raised his gaze to the broken stars, his voice a whisper meant only for the void. "We have ended an age, and in its ending, we have damned the next." The silence answered him, endless and unbroken, as the galaxy turned upon a new axis of despair. The Old Ones were gone, their dominion shattered, their eternity undone. Across the galaxy, their creations scattered in despair, their citadels smouldering as ruins beneath a sky that no longer carried their light. But the silence that followed was not peace. It was the silence of conquest hollowed of meaning, a silence filled with hunger that could not be sated. The Citan, glutted on victory, shone brighter than suns. They strode across the void as masters, their laughter rolling like thunder, their radiance devouring what remained of resistance. The Necrons stood beneath them as obedient husks, their victory nothing more than a feast for gods. Sarek watched from his throne of black stone, his gaze upon the fractured heavens. He had broken the chains of the Old Ones, only to fasten his people into chains of his own making. The Citan had promised eternity as salvation, but in truth they had only given eternity as servitude. His people, soulless and bound, had become harvesters for predators who would never stop hungering. Every world conquered, every life extinguished, was swallowed by the star gods, leaving nothing but emptiness in their wake. Yet in the ashes of despair, the seed of rebellion smouldered. Sharek had seen the truth when the first Citan bled. When their radiance fractured into shards, they could be hurt, they could be broken, they could be bound. And though the price would be unthinkable, he knew there was no path forward but treachery against the very beings who had given them power. He summoned the lords of his dynasties to a chamber deep beneath Saracen itself, a vault sealed away from the sight of star gods. The air was heavy with static, the walls lined with obsidian runes that bent sound into silence. There, Sekhmet and others gathered, their frames glimmering with faint fire, their eyes dim with memory's absence. Sharek's voice rose in the stillness, measured, heavy as iron. We have slain the old ones, yet we are not free. We are cattle herded by the Citan, their slaves in eternity. But know this, gods can bleed, and if they can bleed, they can fall. The time has come not to serve, but to rebel. Murmurs rippled across the chamber, though no true voices lived among them, only the static resonance of transmitted thought. Some recoiled at the audacity, others, long hollowed by obedience, felt nothing at all. But in Sekhmet's dim gaze, there flickered the faintest ember of agreement. She spoke, her tone harsh, clipped. We are bound to your will, Sarek. You speak of rebellion, but rebellion against the gods themselves is suicide. They gave us this form. They bound us into eternity. How do you propose we unmake what we cannot even fully comprehend? Sarek's eyes gleamed like twin coals. By turning their own gift against them, they made us weapons. Weapons can be aimed. Weapons can cut even those who wield them. So began the great deception. Across the dynasties, in shadows hidden from star gods' gaze, the Necrons forged instruments of betrayal. They harvested fragments of shattered Citan, shards still screaming with cosmic hunger, and bound them in cages of impossible design. They built engines not to serve, but to imprison, devices capable of splitting radiant eternity into chains. For centuries, they prepared in silence, their legions marching as obedient slaves, while in secret they plotted their master's fall. The first strike came on the world of Vaith. A Citan descended in radiant hunger, its form a lattice of burning crystal, its laughter filling the sky as it devoured all before it. The Necrons advanced as always, silent and unyielding, but in their midst they carried a weapon hidden even from its prey. At Sarek's command, the trap was sprung. The lattice of light convulsed, shattering as its brilliance was drawn into an obsidian cage. The god screamed, its voice shaking the heavens, but the cage held. A fragment of eternity bound in chains, writhing but broken. The galaxy trembled with revelation. For the first time, the Citan knew fear. Battle by battle, world by world, the rebellion spread. Each engagement became not only war against the remnants of the Old One's creations, but war against the star gods themselves. Some Necrons fell in their service, obeying the radiance that still compelled them, but Sarek's will bound the greater host. And where his will commanded, they struck. One by one, the Citan were shattered, their radiance fractured into countless shards, their voices bound into prisons that howled with rage. But victory bore no joy. The war against gods was terrible beyond reckoning. Whole dynasties were consumed before a single Citan fell, their eternal bodies crushed into fragments, their memories erased forever. The star gods unleashed powers that tore stars asunder, burned galaxies into dust. Yet still the Necrons endured. Still they marched, tireless, unyielding, until the predators of eternity themselves were hunted into chains. At last, the galaxy grew quiet. The old ones were gone. The Citan were broken, their shards bound in prisons scattered across black tombs. The Necrons stood as masters of a silent empire that stretched across the stars. And Sarek, the Silent King, sat upon his throne of black stone, his gaze fixed upon the void. He had won. He had broken every god that had ever enslaved his people. And yet, as he listened to the silence of his legions, he knew the truth. His people were still gone. Their souls had been devoured, their laughter extinguished, their lives erased. They were eternal, but eternal as husks. The war was over, but the curse remained. Immortality had not freed them. It had damned them to a silence deeper than death. Sekhmet came to him once more, her frame scarred by centuries of war. She stood at his side, her gaze fixed on the stars. "You have done it," she said. "You have killed gods. You have freed us." "No," Sarek whispered. "I have only traded one prison for another. We are free of masters, but not of what we have become. We are eternal, yes, but eternity without soul is not freedom. It is only another kind of chain." She bowed her head, her silence answering for her. And so the Silent King sat, surrounded by an empire of tombs, shards of gods howling in their prisons, stars dimming beneath his reign. He had destroyed the old ones. He had broken the Citan. Yet in the hollow chambers of his heart, he knew the greatest truth of all, that in winning everything, he had lost the only thing that mattered. The galaxy lay in silence, broken and dim. The old ones had vanished into extinction, their eternity undone. The Citan, once radiant tyrants, now writhed as fractured shards bound in prisons forged by the very slaves they had enslaved. The Necrons stood triumphant, their legions unyielding, their dominion spanning stars without number. Yet there was no celebration, no songs of victory, no laughter of a people reborn. There was only silence, eternal and absolute, echoing across the tomb worlds. Sarek sat upon his throne, carved from obsidian older than memory, his gaze fixed upon the void beyond. He had achieved the impossible. He had shattered gods. He had avenged his people's torment. He had carved eternity into the bones of the galaxy. And yet, in his hollow chest, there was nothing. His people did not rejoice. They did not weep. They did not feel. They simply stood, awaiting command, their eyes glowing with pale fire that carried no soul behind it. He rose and walked among them. Legions lined the halls of Sarkhan, their forms perfect, their silence suffocating. Once, they had been sons and daughters, mothers and fathers, lovers and friends. Now they were husks, warriors without memory, eternal shells driven by command. He searched their faces as he passed, as if hoping to glimpse a fragment of what had been. But there was nothing. Only the cold, identical mask of metal, unbroken, unfeeling. Sekhmet joined him in those endless halls, her form scarred by millennia of war. She walked at his side, her movements slow, deliberate, her voice carrying the static rasp of eternity. "The war is over," she said. "We have achieved what none believed possible. Yet you walk as though burdened, not freed." Sarek turned to her, his silence long, his eyes dim with grief. "Do you not see it, Sekhmet? The war is over, but our people are gone. We have won eternity, but eternity has stolen all that made us who we were. We no longer live, we endure, and endurance is not life." She said nothing, for she could not argue. She too had once remembered warmth, but now even the echoes of those memories slipped further into void. They were weapons, nothing more, and weapons knew no joy in victory. The tomb worlds grew quiet in their endless routine. Dynasties once filled with ambition now stood in lifeless order. The Necrons obeyed commands, fought when told, marched when told, but without purpose, without meaning. The galaxy belonged to them, yet they could not feel its weight. They had achieved supremacy, yet it tasted of ash. Sharek withdrew into solitude. In the black deserts of his home world, beneath the venomous star that no longer burned him, he stood alone. The wind hissed across the sand, carrying the dust of uncounted dead. He closed his eyes, though there was no breath to carry the scent of the desert, no heartbeat to quicken at the memory of his youth. He felt nothing, and in feeling nothing, he felt despair deeper than any wound. One night, he descended into the crypts beneath the capital, where the shards of Citan writhed in their prisons. Their voices shrieked in silence, radiance bleeding against the chains that bound them. He walked among their cages, his gaze fixed upon their brilliance, and he spoke in a whisper that only the void could hear. "You gave us eternity," he said, "and I believed it was deliverance. But it was a curse. You devoured our souls, our laughter, our grief, and now we are nothing but echoes of your hunger. You are bound, but so are we. You are broken, but so are we. We are not free. We will never be free." The shards screamed wordless rage, but Sarek only turned away, his silence heavier than their fury. In the centuries that followed, the galaxy grew still. The Necrons held dominion unchallenged, their rule absolute. Yet with no gods to fight, no enemies to vanquish, their silence became unbearable. Dynasties stood in stasis, their lords drifting further into apathy, their legions standing guard over tombs filled with nothing but dust. Some buried themselves willingly, entombing entire armies in eternal slumber, waiting for a future that might never come. Others drifted into endless cycles of meaningless war against the remnants of the Old One's creations. Not out of necessity, but out of habit, Sharek wandered the tomb worlds, and everywhere he saw the same truth. A people cursed to endure without purpose. He saw soldiers standing in eternal lines, their eyes glowing faintly as they awaited commands that would never come. He saw dynasties locked in silence, their halls filled with shadows and stillness. He saw galaxies under his dominion, and yet felt no triumph, only the suffocating weight of absence. Sekhmet came to him once more. She found him standing upon the black cliffs of a tomb world, gazing into the poisoned light of its dying sun. "You cannot bear this silence forever," she said. "Even you, silent king, are not immune. If we cannot find meaning in eternity, then eternity will consume us." Sarek turned, his voice a whisper low as wind over stone. "There is no meaning left. I sought to save us, but in saving us I destroyed us. There is no redemption, only the long shadow of what we were. The curse of eternity is not death. It is that there will never be death." She bowed her head, unable to answer. That night, Sharek stood alone in his throne room, the stars burning faintly beyond the void. He looked upon the galaxy he had conquered, the empire he had forged from silence, and he felt the truth settle like stone upon him. There was no future for his people. They were eternal, but eternal as husks. They would endure, but endurance meant nothing without life. He whispered into the silence, words meant only for the void. "We are eternal, but eternity is not freedom. It is punishment. It is the shadow of life without its light. And I, who sought to save us, am the one who has damned us." The halls echoed with nothing but silence, and in that silence, the weight of his curse grew heavier still. The silence of the galaxy had become a living thing, heavy and suffocating. Yet even in its stillness, echoes of chaos lingered. The Citan, shattered and bound, writhed in prisons of obsidian and starfire, their fragments radiating a light that burned without warmth. The Necrons, countless and unbroken, marched upon worlds no longer inhabited by life, their steps stirring dust that had long forgotten sound. Zarek walked among them, the silent king, whose throne now sat upon the ashes of eternity itself. Every command he issued rang through the legions, absolute, unflinching. Yet in the hollows of their shells there was nothing left to obey beyond the memory of compulsion. The final confrontations unfolded not with fire or flesh, but with silence and inevitability. The remnants of the Old One's creations, the elder, Krork, and lesser species, sought refuge upon the last unbroken worlds, their hopes fragile as glass. Yet the Necrons descended upon them, precise, unerring. Each strike a message carried in cold radiance. There is no escape, no salvation, no mercy. The galaxy had become a tomb, every step a march toward its ultimate stillness. Sharek moved through the battlefield of Therathis Prime. The sky shattered, with storms of residual energy, remnants of broken Cetan radiance coiling in rivers across the heavens. His legions advanced without pause, yet he felt no pride, no satisfaction. Only the weight of what had been lost pressed upon him, the laughter of children, the warmth of touch, the taste of wind upon living flesh, all gone, consumed by the bargains struck in desperation, stripped away in the pursuit of vengeance and survival. He came upon a fragment of a Cetan, imprisoned in a lattice of obsidian chains, its light flickering like a dying sun. It shrieked without voice, thrashing against its bounds. Sarek stared, and for the first time in millennia, he felt a reflection of himself within the radiant madness, both bound, both eternal, both hollowed by the pursuit of power. The god had promised deliverance, yet it had wrought only slavery, and he, the silent king, had delivered it willingly to his own people. Sekhmet appeared beside him, her form scarred, her movement deliberate. "You cannot undo what has been done," she said, the static rasp of her voice echoing across the empty plain. "The old ones are gone, the Cetan bound, yet we remain, and in remaining we endure their hunger. Our eternity is our prison." Zarek's gaze did not waver. "I know," he said. "Every victory, every conquest, every shattered god has left us nothing. We are eternal, yes, but eternal as shells, eternal as shadows. I sought to save them, and in doing so, I doomed us all." The ground trembled beneath the march of legions as the last defenders of the Old One's creations were annihilated. No cries rose to the stars, for no voice remained to call. Cities fell in seconds, forests burned to ash, oceans boiled beneath weapons that sang with frozen light. The Necrons were perfect, unfeeling, unstoppable, yet in their perfection lay a horror greater than defeat. They had achieved everything, and in achieving it, lost all meaning. A council of lords gathered in Sharek's tomb city, their forms gleaming in cold black metal, the remnants of ambition and rivalry subsumed into absolute obedience. For the first time, Sharek addressed them not as master commanding, but as witness to the emptiness that had become their existence. "You are eternal," he said, his voice carrying without echo. "And yet you are empty. We have destroyed our enemies, we have shattered gods, yet we remain prisoners of what we have become. Our victory is hollow. Our eternity is a cage. The galaxy is ours, yet it no longer belongs to anyone." Silence answered, endless and absolute. There was no dissent, no murmur, no question, only the weight of truth carried in cold light. In that silence, Sharek understood the finality of what he had wrought. The war was over. The Old Ones were no more. The Cetan were bound. The galaxy lay silent beneath his command. And yet, he knew that the cost of victory was greater than even he had imagined. Eternity was not freedom. It was penance. It was the slow, unending agony of existence without release. He moved among his people, observing their flawless forms. No expression marred the metal masks. No hesitation, no sorrow, no hope remained. They were unbroken, and in their unbroken state, there was nothing left to guide, nothing left to inspire, nothing left to mourn. Every lesson, every laughter, every grief had been stripped away in the pursuit of survival and vengeance. They were eternal, yes, but eternal as slaves, eternal as tombs. Sekhmet approached him once more. "What now?" she asked, though even her voice lacked the warmth it had once carried. Zarek gazed toward the void, toward the fractured stars and the bound shards of Sitan. "Now," he said, "we endure. We will march, we will watch, we will exist. And in our endurance, we will remember only what we cannot forget. The cost of eternity is not measured in victory, but in loss, and we have lost everything that made us alive." He walked through the city, past the endless columns of legions standing in silence, past the tombs of fallen gods writhing in their cages, past the ruins of worlds emptied of life. Everywhere he looked, the truth remained the same. Perfection had been achieved, and in that perfection, all meaning was gone. At last, he ascended to the highest tower of Sarikhan, gazing down upon the galaxy sprawled beneath him like a map of ash. The stars flickered weakly, remnants of the light that had once guided mortals, now dim against the unyielding darkness. And in that moment, Zarek understood the final truth of his reign. He had won everything, and in winning, he had condemned all that mattered to silence. He whispered into the void, a voice for no one and for all eternity. "We have conquered gods. We have shattered immortality. And yet, in doing so, we are no closer to life than the dead we have left behind. Eternity is ours, and it is nothing." Sekhmet stood beside him, her gaze upon the horizon where the last remnants of resistance had fallen. "Then we endure," she said, her voice a quiet echo. Zarek nodded, though there was no relief in the gesture. They would endure, as they always had, as they always would. The galaxy was theirs, and yet it belonged to no one. The silence that followed was eternal, unbroken, and in its weight. The cost of all that had been done settled upon him like stone, and in the stillness the stars themselves seemed to dim, acknowledging the finality of what had been wrought. The galaxy lay in absolute stillness. Worlds that had burned under the fury of the Necrons' march now remained as tombs of stone and metal. Oceans boiled into ash, forests petrified into silence, and skies, once alive with stars and suns, flickered faintly, exhausted of their fire. The old ones had vanished. The Sitan was shattered and bound. Entire civilizations were erased. Yet among all this, one truth remained immutable. Life itself had been sacrificed for the eternity of shells. Sharek, the silent king, stood at the heart of the empire he had forged, and in the stillness he understood the full weight of his actions. He walked through the halls of Sarikhan, his steps echoing on black stone, the only sound in a world stripped of music. The legions of Necrons lined the corridors, their forms identical, flawless, unbroken. They were eternal, yes, but eternal without soul. Each movement, each flicker of glowing eyes, reminded him that victory had devoured not the galaxy alone, but the very essence of his people. They marched, they obeyed, they endured, but they no longer lived, and he had made it so. Sekhmet appeared at his side, her frame glimmering faintly in the dim light of the throne chamber. The war is complete, she said, voice like static whispering across empty corridors. The old ones are gone, the Citan bound. Your enemies have fallen, yet you do not rejoice. Sharek's eyes, pale and cold as frozen stars, gazed across the silent masses. Rejoice, he whispered. What is there to rejoice? We have won everything, and yet we have lost everything that mattered. Immortality was our goal, and we have it, but the price is more than I can bear to name. There is no life left here, only the echo of what once was. We have become gods of nothingness, kings of ruins, rulers of a silence that will endure longer than time itself. He walked among his legions, observing their perfect forms, their flawless obedience. Once they had been flesh and blood, capable of laughter, grief, fear, and hope. Now they were monuments to eternity, but monuments without meaning. Every victory had stripped them further of what made them human, or what remained of their human memory. Their obedience was total, but it carried no spirit. Sarek realized then that his triumph was a tomb, not a crown. Above, the stars seemed to dim under the weight of their deeds. Shards of shattered Citan writhed in their obsidian prisons, radiance dripping from broken forms, a chorus of eternal anguish. The silent king gazed upon them, feeling the echo of their rage reverberate through his consciousness. Once, he had believed he could control eternity, bend it to his will. Now he understood the crueler truth. Eternity could not be controlled. It consumed, it endures, and it mocks those who would claim it as a prize. The throne room itself had become a mausoleum. The walls, once etched with the histories of dynasties, now told stories only Sharek could read. Chronicles of sacrifice, of vengeance, of ambition consumed by consequence. Every carving reminded him of lives extinguished, of futures erased, of joy that had been swallowed by the hunger for survival and power. The air was thick with the memory of absence, and in it he felt the weight of solitude greater than any war he had waged. He descended to the black terraces overlooking the hollowed plains of Sarkhan. Beneath him lay the ruins of his empire, legions standing in endless order, armies that would march for millennia without fatigue or hesitation, yet never again would they feel. He raised his gaze to the remnants of the skies, where the last faint light of stars bled through fractured clouds and whispered into the void. We have conquered all, and in our conquest, we have destroyed the only things that made victory meaningful. We are eternal, yes, but eternal as tombs, and eternity without life is the cruelest fate of all. Sekhmet joined him, her presence the only reminder that he had not been wholly alone in this desolation. And the cost, she asked. Can it ever be measured? Sarek's gaze did not waver. It cannot be measured. Not in stars, not in blood, not in time. It is infinite, as is our suffering. We have gained everything and lost more than any being could survive. What remains is silence, and in that silence, the memory of what we were will gnaw at us for all eternity. He looked down upon the tomb worlds that stretched beyond the horizon, black deserts punctuated by the faint glow of lifeless cities. The legions below him, countless and eternal, awaited command. They would march, they would conquer, they would endure, yet they would do so in emptiness, in a perfection stripped of purpose. The galaxy belonged to them, and yet it belonged to no one. The empire he had forged was absolute, yet hollow, magnificent and desolate all at once. Sharek raised his hand in final command, not to wage war, not to conquer, but to order the enduring march of his people. They obeyed, flawless and unbroken, their steps resonating through the plains like the tolling of 1,000 bells, each one silent. The empire would continue, but it would continue as nothing more than an echo of its creator's ambition. The glory he had sought, the vengeance he had wrought, had become a monument to emptiness. He turned to Sekhmet, and though neither of them possessed the warmth to feel it, the silence between them spoke volumes. "The galaxy is ours," he said, "but it is ours in the way a tomb belongs to the dead. We endure, yes, but what is eternity without meaning? What is victory without life?" Sekhmet said nothing, for there was no answer. There had never been one. Zarek gazed into the dark horizon, where dying suns flickered against the void like failing candles. In that gaze, he saw the full measure of what had been wrought. The old ones had fallen, the Citan were bound, the Necrons were eternal, and yet, in all this triumph, there was nothing to celebrate. The galaxy was silent, the stars dim, the legions perfect but empty, and he, their king, was alone among them. He whispered again, to the void, to the shards of the gods, to the endless legions, to nothing at all. "We have survived the war, and in surviving, we have perished. Immortality is ours, and it is a curse. Eternity is ours, and it is a tomb. The galaxy endures, and yet nothing lives. This is the cost of all we have done, the price of all we sought, and the fate that shall follow us forever." The wind stirred across the black terraces, carrying dust that had no scent, echoes of silence that had no sound. Jarek remained unmoving, staring into the poisoned stars, feeling the weight of eternity heavier than any crown, heavier than any weapon, heavier than the memory of all that had been lost. His empire would endure, his legions would endure, and in that endurance they would never know life again. And as the stars blinked out one by one, beneath the weight of an empire built on silence and vengeance, Zarek understood the final, cruelest truth of all, that in winning everything, he had ensured that nothing of true value remained. Eternity was theirs, and it was nothing.